In 1974, a Chinese farmer digging a well found a dead man staring back at him. Not a skeleton, not a body. A face, a human face made of clay. He kept digging, then he found another, and another, and another. Within weeks, archaeologists realized that beneath the earth, outside Xi'an, was something almost impossible to comprehend. An army, thousands of soldiers, standing in formation, infantry, archers, generals, chariots, horses, weapons. An entire military force buried for more than 2,000 years. But these soldiers had never fought a battle. They had been built for something much stranger. To fight after their emperor was dead. The man who ordered them into the earth was Qin Shi Huang. And if you've never heard his name before, remember it. Because this man changed the history of China forever. He conquered 7 kingdoms that had spent generations trying to destroy one another. He erased their borders, standardized their writing, their weights, their currency, connected roads across his new empire. And in 221 BC, he did something nobody before him had ever done. He declared himself the first emperor. But Qin Shi Huang had a problem. He could conquer kingdoms, he could command armies. But there was one enemy he couldn't defeat: death. The emperor became obsessed with immortality. Expeditions searching for legendary islands, alchemists brewing potions that may have contained mercury. The substance he hoped would save his life may have helped destroy it. He died at 49, and his empire, built to last forever, collapsed within years. But the army beneath the earth remained waiting for nearly 2,000 years. Until a farmer looking for water found the first soldier. The emperor disappeared. His dynasty disappeared. His empire disappeared. But the army he built for eternity survived him by more than 2,000 years. And that tells us something extraordinary about China. Because Qin Shi Huang wasn't the beginning of the civilization. Not even close. Before Qin, before the Great Wall, before Confucius, before the famous emperors, people were already building cities beside the Yellow River, farming, fighting, ruling, and eventually they began writing, carving questions into turtle shells and animal bones. Will it rain? Will the harvest succeed? Will the king win the battle? 3,000 years later, we can still read some of those questions. Their kings are gone, their cities are buried, but their writing survived. Because China did not survive for thousands of years by remaining unchanged. It survived by changing constantly. For thousands of years, China faced the same terrifying question, again and again. What happens when the old world collapses? So forget the Great Wall for a moment. Forget the Terracotta Army. We need to go back to a time before any of it existed, to a landscape dominated by one enormous river. A river that could feed millions and kill them just as easily, because along its banks, people stopped simply surviving the river. They began to control it. And in doing so, they began to build a civilization. Long before emperors ruled from palaces, northern China was a world of villages. Farmers, potters, hunters, families burying their dead with objects for another world. There was no China yet, no emperor, no single culture covering the region. The Yellow River Basin was one of the most important. Its floods brought fertile soil and destroyed everything in their path. Controlling that river required cooperation on a scale no single family could manage. Someone had to organize the labor, store the grain, defend the settlement, and eventually, someone became the ruler. This is one of civilization's oldest patterns. Surplus creates hierarchy, and hierarchy creates government. Later tradition remembered a legendary ruler, Yu the Great, who tamed the floods and founded China's first dynasty, the Jia. For centuries, Chinese historians treated this as the beginning of their history. Modern archaeology has found sophisticated Bronze Age societies that may connect to those traditions. But we can't treat every ancient story as documentary fact. That distinction matters because it's a theme that runs through everything ahead. The relationship between history and memory. Eventually, we reach a civilization the evidence speaks for directly, the Shang. And with the Shang, China begins to leave us something extraordinary, a voice. The Shang ruled the Yellow River region from roughly 1600 BC. Cities, bronze vessels, armies, all commanded by a single royal court, a royal court that ruled through political power and religion at once, kings claiming to speak directly for gods and ancestors alike. But the Shang left historians something more valuable than gold. Questions, carved into turtle shells and animal bones. Will rain come? Should the army attack? Will the king recover? A ritual specialist heated the bone until it cracked and read the pattern in the fractures. Those carved characters belong to the earliest known stage of Chinese writing, a script that would change enormously over 3,000 years, but it never disappeared. A symbol carved by a Shang scribe is part of a tradition that is still, in some form, legible today. Writing changed the relationship between the living and the dead. A king could die, but his words could remain. The Shang also mastered bronze on a scale that demonstrated real state power. Mines, craftsmen, transport, organization, all commanded by the court. But power creates enemies. To the west, a rising people called the Zhou were about to end Shang rule. And in doing so, they'd face an urgent question. Having just overthrown a king, why should anyone accept them as legitimate? The Zhou didn't simply say, "We won." They argued that heaven itself had withdrawn its favor from the Shang, that the dynasty had become corrupt, and heaven had transferred its mandate to them instead. This became the mandate of heaven, and hidden inside it was a genuinely radical idea. A ruler's right to govern was not permanent. Heaven could give the mandate, and heaven could take it away. A cruel or incompetent ruler could be read as evidence the mandate had already been lost, which meant every successful rebel, forever after, had a ready-made justification. We did not destroy legitimate government. It had already lost heaven's favor. But the Zhou's own kingdom was too large to govern directly. Regional rulers, granted their own territories, grew steadily more independent over generations until the center could no longer hold. The kingdom fractured into competing states. First, the spring and autumn period, then the long, brutal warring states period that followed it. And when the old order stops working, people start asking why. Confucius lived at the start of this unraveling. He wasn't building a religion. He was trying to solve a political crisis. If a ruler behaved like a ruler, a father like a father, if officials were educated and self-disciplined, society could hold together through moral example rather than force alone. Others disagreed. Taoist tradition, built around the teachings attributed to Laozi, argued against trying to control everything. That harmony came from aligning with the natural way, the Tao, not fighting it. And then came the legalists, with a much colder answer. Human beings could not be trusted to behave morally on their own. What a state needed was clear law, real punishment, and total organization. As the warring states period intensified, that argument stopped being philosophical and became existential. This wasn't small-scale conflict. It was an arms race. States that could feed bigger armies, tax more efficiently, and organize their populations survived. The ones that couldn't disappeared. Sun Tzu's art of war emerged from exactly this world, and its real lesson wasn't brute strength. It was intelligence. Know yourself, know your enemy. Win before the battle even begins. One state took the legalist answer and built an entire society around it. Farmers gained status through military service. Laws reached into every corner of daily life. Its name was Qin, and its ruler had a goal no one else in this story had ever had. Not to win the war, but to end the entire system that produced it. Yingzheng became king of Qin as a child and grew into one of the most formidable rulers of the ancient world. One by one, Qin's rivals fell. Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, Qi. Until in 221 BC, nothing remained to conquer. He rejected the old word for king. He called himself Huangdi, emperor. The first ever so, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. Conquest alone wasn't enough. The old kingdoms could still rebel if their differences survived. So he standardized everything that had let them function as separate nations. Writing, currency, weights, measurements, even the width of cart axles. Roads connected the empire directly. Infrastructure itself became a tool of control. It came at enormous human cost. Forced labor on a scale China had never seen, building roads, walls, palaces, and eventually his own tomb, and the underground army meant to guard him into whatever came next. You already know how that story ends. The Mercury, the fear of death he could never conquer, the dynasty that outlived him by only a handful of years. What survived wasn't the dynasty. It was the idea he proved, that a unified Chinese empire was possible at all. The next dynasty would inherit that idea and learn from exactly where he'd gone wrong. Liu Bang, the Han dynasty's founder, was no aristocrat, a minor official who rose through the chaos after Qin's collapse. His lesson from watching Qin fall apart was precise. Centralized government worked. Terror alone did not. So the Han kept much of Qin's administrative machine, but rebuilt its foundation around Confucian ideas. Government became something closer to a moral project. Officials expected to be educated, cultured, aware of history, not merely obedient. To the north, the Han fought the Yongnu for generations. War, diplomacy, marriage alliances, trade, whatever worked. Their westward campaigns pushed Chinese influence deep into Central Asia, and out of that pressure grew a vast trading network we now call the Silk Road. Silk moving west, horses and ideas moving east. China becoming part of a far larger world. And inside the empire, history itself became an institution. Sima Qian, a court historian punished brutally for defending a general who'd surrendered, kept working anyway. Producing the records of the Grand Historian, an attempt to explain the entire political and human world of China. Kings, rebels, merchants, philosophers, people who succeeded, and people who destroyed themselves. He understood something that would shape Chinese governance for 2,000 years. History isn't simply the past. It's a warning to the present. Even the Han eventually succumbed to the same forces that end every dynasty in this story. Court factions, concentrated power, rebellion. And when it fell, China fractured again. Three warlord states, Wei, Shu, and Wu, fought for the ruins of Han authority. In a period later generations would turn into legend, the Three Kingdoms. Strategists became famous. Battles like Red Cliffs became cultural touchstones that outlived the actual politics behind them. But the deeper pattern mattered more than the legend. For centuries afterward, China moved between fragmentation and partial unity. Northern and southern kingdoms rising and falling, nomadic peoples migrating in, Buddhism spreading from Central Asia and slowly becoming genuinely Chinese. Through all of it, farming continued, families continued, texts kept being copied. Eventually, the short-lived Sui dynasty reunified the country and built the Grand Canal, connecting the agricultural south to the political north. One of the greatest infrastructure projects in Chinese history. But like Qin before them, the Sui demanded too much, too fast. Rebellion followed. The dynasty collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen, and out of its ruins came one of the greatest eras China would ever produce. Imagine walking through Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty. You might see merchants from Central Asia, monks, diplomats, musicians, foreign travelers, luxury goods, horses, silk, spices. The city was one of the great cosmopolitan centers of the medieval world. Tang armies pushed deep into Central Asia. Its poets, Li Bai, Du Fu, produced work that still read more than 1,000 years later. And its politics produced something almost unthinkable elsewhere in the period. Wu Zetian. She began as a concubine. She became empress. And eventually, she ruled as emperor in her own name. Her reign was controversial. She could be ruthless, but she was also politically capable. She expanded the bureaucracy, used officials strategically, and strengthened the central state. The Tang world was also deeply influenced by Buddhism. Monasteries became wealthy. Buddhist art flourished. Monks traveled long distances. Chinese pilgrims went to India to study Buddhist texts. The civilization was absorbing ideas from far beyond its borders. But greatness has a price. The Tang Empire became difficult to control. Military governors gained power. Court factions fought. And in the 8th century, a rebellion led by An Lushan exploded across the empire. The consequences were devastating. Cities were destroyed. Population losses were enormous. The Song reunified much of China, but never solved the military problem. Powerful rivals sat permanently on their northern border. So their greatest achievements weren't military. They were economic, technological, urban. Cities grew to a scale unmatched anywhere in the world at the time. Paper money appeared. Printing spread, meaning texts no longer had to be copied by hand one at a time, and knowledge could reach a scale of readers no previous era had managed. Gunpowder, the magnetic compass, advanced shipbuilding, iron production, at levels Europe wouldn't reach for centuries. An examination system built around classical learning opened government service to talent rather than birth alone, tying education directly to status in a way that would shape Chinese society for the rest of its imperial history. But wealth and invention were never enough to guarantee safety. To the north, a new power was rising, one that would prove far more dangerous than any rival state before it. By the early 13th century, the Mongol tribes had been transformed from rival clans into one extraordinary military machine. Genghis Khan had accomplished something previous steppe leaders repeatedly failed to achieve. He made obedience stronger than tribal rivalry. They recruited engineers from conquered peoples, adopted Chinese siege technology, and turned knowledge from defeated enemies into weapons. The first great Chinese obstacle was the Qin Dynasty, which controlled northern China and possessed formidable cities and armies. The fighting was brutal, and the Mongols increasingly used terror deliberately, hoping cities would surrender before their walls were breached. One city after another fell, and the Mongol frontier moved steadily southward toward the heartlands of Chinese civilization. But northern China was only part of the story. Farther south, the southern Song remained wealthy, densely populated, and remarkably difficult to defeat. The Song possessed enormous economic resources, fortified cities, experienced administrators, and armies capable of resisting Mongol pressure for decades. The Mongols therefore adapted again, learning how to fight not only across open plains, but along China's enormous rivers. When Kublai Khan inherited leadership of the Mongol Empire, he made the conquest of Song China his central political ambition. Unlike his grandfather, Kublai increasingly presented himself not simply as a conqueror, but as China's rightful emperor. He adopted Chinese institutions while preserving Mongol privilege, creating a government that was neither entirely foreign nor entirely Chinese. In 1271, Kublai formally proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, giving his new Chinese empire a dynastic name. Yet the southern Song still stood, its final strongholds refusing to surrender, even as Mongol armies closed around them. The final campaign became a struggle of rivers, fortified cities, naval battles, famine, and relentless Mongol pressure. In 1279, the last major Song resistance collapsed, ending a dynasty that had survived the Mongol advance for decades. For the first time, the entire Chinese realm was ruled by a dynasty whose founders came from the steppe. The conquest had been extraordinarily violent, but the new rulers soon faced a different problem: how to govern what they had conquered. China's vast population, complex taxation system, productive agriculture, crowded cities, and deeply rooted bureaucracy were far too extensive to govern through Mongol customs alone. The Mongols had conquered China, but ruling it required understanding millions of farmers, managing enormous tax networks, and preserving the institutions that kept its cities and economy functioning. Steppe traditions could command armies and organize conquest, but they could not by themselves minister China's fields, markets, population registers, granaries, and government offices. To rule China effectively, the Mongols had to rely on Chinese administrators, taxation systems, agricultural records, urban institutions, and bureaucratic practices developed over centuries. The empire's scale forced the Mongols to adapt because China's population, farmland, cities, and administrative machinery were simply too vast for traditional nomadic customs to control. Kublai Khan understood this clearly and gradually reshaped Mongol rule into an imperial government designed specifically for China. He adopted Chinese imperial traditions, presented himself as a legitimate emperor, and established the Yuan dynasty in 1271. But becoming emperor of China did not mean abandoning the Mongol world that had created his power. The Yuan court remained distinctly Mongol, and social divisions separated the conquerors from many of the people they ruled. Yet beyond those divisions, the empire created connections between China and lands thousands of miles away across Eurasia. Chinese silk and porcelain traveled west, while horses, metals, spices, textiles, and foreign ideas traveled toward China. Travelers could cross territories that had once been divided by war, bringing cultures and technologies into closer contact than before. For a time, the Mongol Empire made Eurasia feel smaller, connecting distant regions through an enormous network of movement and exchange. But the same enormous scale that created opportunity also made the Yuan state expensive, complicated, and increasingly difficult to control. Tax demands increased, corruption spread through parts of the administration, and ordinary farmers increasingly carried the burden of imperial spending. Then, environmental disasters began striking regions already weakened by economic pressure, turning hardship into a crisis the government struggled to contain. Floods destroyed crops, drought followed in other regions, and famine pushed desperate people toward rebellion. Rebellions appeared across China, and what began as scattered unrest gradually became a direct challenge to Yuan authority. Among the many rebels was a poor young man whose early life had taught him hunger, hardship, and survival. His name was Zhu Yuanzhang, and before becoming a military leader, he had spent time wandering as a Buddhist monk. The rebellion gave him something poverty never had: followers, military experience, political influence, and eventually an army of his own. He proved unusually capable at turning a loose rebellion into disciplined forces that could capture cities and defeat rival commanders. While other rebel leaders fought among themselves, Zhu steadily consolidated territory and built the strongest political base in eastern China. His forces then moved north, targeting the Yuan capital and the imperial government that had ruled China for generations. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang's forces captured Dadu, the Yuan capital, while the Mongol court retreated north toward the steppe. The Mongol dynasty had ruled China for less than a century, but its defeat completed one of history's most remarkable reversals. The conquerors had taken China by force, adapted to its institutions, and finally lost it through the same cycle of dynastic collapse. Zhu Yuanzhang now faced the challenge every new Chinese dynasty inherited, turning victory into stable government. He would build a fiercely centralized state, determined to prevent the disorder and corruption that had helped destroy the Yuan. The Yuan had fallen, but the pattern continued. Conquest, adaptation, crisis, rebellion, and another dynasty rising from the ruins. The Mongols had conquered China, but China had survived them, absorbed their rule, and moved forward into another imperial age. Zhu Yuanzhang rose from poverty and rebellion to become emperor, determined to rebuild China under Ming rule. In 1368, he founded the Ming Dynasty, ending Mongol rule and restoring a Chinese imperial government. Hongwu distrusted powerful officials and generals, concentrating authority in the emperor's hands more tightly than before. The Ming state was rebuilt around farming, taxation, military service, and strict social order. But China remained wealthy and powerful, attracting neighboring states seeking trade, technology, and imperial favor. Under the Mongol emperor, Ming power expanded northward as Beijing became the new imperial capital. Beijing became the center of Ming power, with the emperor surrounded by officials, soldiers, servants, and administrators. And across the sea, Ming China possessed enormous ships and an emperor willing to send them beyond its shores. In 1405, the Mongol emperor sent Zheng He on a voyage unlike anything China had attempted before. His fleet carried thousands of people, enormous quantities of supplies, and ships built on a staggering scale. Zheng He's voyages crossed Southeast Asia, reaching India and connecting Ming China with distant maritime kingdoms. From India, the fleet continued westward, carrying Chinese envoys toward Arabia and the distant shores of Africa. In Arabia, Chinese envoys encountered wealthy ports where merchants traded goods from across 3 continents. The fleet eventually reached the East African coast, bringing China into direct contact with societies thousands of kilometers away. These voyages were not simply trading missions. They displayed Ming wealth, power, diplomacy, and the emperor's reach across the seas. For a brief moment, Ming China looked outward with extraordinary confidence, projecting its influence across half the known maritime world. Then, almost as suddenly as they had begun, the great voyages came to an end. The court shifted its priorities toward China's land frontiers, especially the growing threat from the north. The empire had turned back toward the continent, and the northern frontier would consume increasing attention and resources. The age of enormous ocean voyages had ended, but the Ming Empire still faced a frontier it could never ignore. The Ming had turned away from the oceans, but the northern frontier remained a permanent threat. Mongol groups beyond the frontier remained capable of sudden raids, forcing the Ming to maintain large armies. Earlier walls already existed, but the Ming rebuilt, connected, and strengthened enormous sections along the northern frontier. The wall was never one continuous structure built at once. It was a frontier system built and rebuilt over centuries. Watchtowers allowed soldiers to observe distant movement and communicate warnings rapidly across the frontier. But walls alone could not defend China. Behind them stood armies, supply routes, horses, farms, and entire frontier communities. Maintaining this frontier was enormously expensive. consuming soldiers, grain, money, and attention that the empire needed elsewhere. By the 16th century, the Ming faced pressure not only from the north, but from problems within its own borders. The empire was still powerful, but beneath its walls, financial and social pressures were beginning to accumulate. Then climate changed, harvests failed, and hunger began turning hardship into something far more dangerous. Rebellion would soon spread across the countryside, and the dynasty's northern defenses could no longer protect it from collapse. The Ming had spent centuries building walls against enemies outside China. Its greatest crisis was now coming from within. By the early 17th century, the Ming Empire was fighting problems it could no longer control. Years of financial strain had weakened the government, while drought and famine devastated communities across the empire. For starving farmers, rebellion became less dangerous than remaining obedient to a government that could no longer feed them. Rebel armies multiplied, and among their leaders was Li Zicheng, who would eventually march toward Beijing. At the same time, another threat was gathering beyond the Great Wall, the Manchus in the northeast. The Manchus had built a powerful state of their own, combining military strength with political organization. The Ming now faced enemies from both directions, while its own government struggled to maintain control. In April 1644, Li Zicheng's forces entered Beijing, and the Ming court began to collapse. The last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, climbed a hill overlooking the city and faced the end alone. But the fall of Beijing did not mean the end of the struggle for China. A Ming general opened the Great Wall to the Manchus, hoping to use them against the rebels. Instead, the Manchus crossed the frontier, defeated the rebels, and claimed the imperial capital for themselves. The Ming had ruled China for nearly 3 centuries. Now another dynasty was taking its place. The Manchus had entered Beijing as conquerors, but defeating the Ming was only the beginning. Now they had to rule China. They understood that military conquest alone could not govern hundreds of millions of people with centuries of Chinese political traditions. So the Qing adopted the institutions they had inherited, keeping Confucian government and Chinese bureaucracy at the heart of imperial rule. The result was unusual. A foreign ruling house presenting itself not as an occupier, but as the legitimate Chinese dynasty. Under Kangxi, the dynasty became increasingly secure, combining military strength with an increasingly sophisticated imperial administration. Kangxi personally campaigned against threats to Qing authority, helping transform a conquered kingdom into a durable empire. Over the following decades, Qing armies pushed outward, creating one of the largest territorial empires in China's history. Tibet came under Qing influence, while Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan were brought into the expanding imperial system. By the 18th century, Qing China was one of the world's wealthiest and most populous political powers. Its cities were crowded, its markets active, and its agricultural economy supported a population growing at extraordinary speed. But prosperity carried a hidden danger. More people meant greater pressure on land, food, taxation, and the imperial bureaucracy. Corruption and administrative weakness slowly became harder to ignore, even while the empire still appeared powerful from outside. At the same time, European merchants were becoming increasingly interested in China's enormous markets, and especially its demand for silver. Britain wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China had little interest in buying enough British goods to balance the trade. Silver flowed toward China, creating a problem for British merchants, desperate to find something Chinese buyers would actually purchase. The answer was opium, grown extensively in British-controlled India and secretly sold into the Chinese market. Chinese merchants smuggled the drug into coastal ports, and addiction spread as silver once again began flowing out of China. Qing officials knew the trade was destroying lives and weakening the economy, but stopping it meant confronting powerful foreign merchants. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu was sent to Guangzhou with orders to destroy the illegal opium trade. Lin confiscated enormous quantities of opium and ordered the drug destroyed, believing the Qing state had every right to defend its people. Britain rejected the confiscation and demanded compensation, while the Qing government refused to restore the trade. The dispute became war. British ships appeared along the Chinese coast, bringing a military technology the Qing had badly underestimated. British naval forces could move quickly along the coast, attack fortified positions, and exploit weaknesses in Qing defenses. The Qing army fought back, but its outdated weapons, poor coordination, and weak naval defenses could not match Britain. The war exposed something larger than a military weakness. The world around China was changing faster than the Qing understood. Britain's industrial economy, naval power, and increasingly modern weapons had created an imbalance the old imperial system struggled to answer. By 1842, the Qing government was ready to negotiate, not because it had solved the crisis, but because it had lost. The Treaty of Nanjing forced China to open several ports to British trade and surrender Hong Kong. China had lost territory, trading privileges, and control over parts of its own coastline. The defeat shattered confidence in a dynasty that had once seemed powerful enough to dominate East Asia indefinitely. Yet the Opium War was only the beginning. Other foreign powers soon demanded similar access, concessions, and privileges. The old world of tributary relationships and imperial confidence was beginning to give way to something China had never faced before. For centuries, China had survived invasions by absorbing conquerors into its civilization. This challenge was fundamentally different. The threat was not simply another army. It was an industrial system transforming warfare, trade, transportation, and global power. The Qing would survive the Opium War, but it would never again possess the same unquestioned authority. What followed would be decades of rebellion, foreign pressure, failed reforms, and increasingly desperate attempts to save the dynasty. The Qing was not yet finished, but the old imperial order had entered its final and most dangerous chapter. China had survived the Shang, Zhou, Qin, Han, Tang, Song, Mongol, and Ming worlds. But survival would now require transformation. The emperors would continue for decades, but their world was already changing beyond their control. The empire that had ruled China for centuries would eventually fall, but the civilization beneath it would continue.